Two. Well, hello, Happy New Year. For those of you who may be catching this in the first week of January, this is the first week of January, right? Yeah.
It
Welcome
is.
to another edition of the Church Solutions Podcast. My name is Phil Thompson, and Michael Gray is with us today. Michael, how are you?
Doing great.
All right. Normally we have Steve Lacy, part of things. Steve is not with us today. He'll be back with us on another podcast here in the near future. So, did you have a nice New Year's, Michael?
Yes, very uneventful, which is what I was going for this year.
Yes, absolutely. That's
Good move.
absolutely that's my philosophy as well. Well, we have a guest today on our podcast. This is we're going to talk today about the challenge of ministry and marriage. And it is a challenge, but we're going to kind of dissect that a little more. This is episode 271 in this format, although we've been doing video podcasts for well over 10 years. Clay Arnold is our guest today. Clay is part of HeartLife Coaching. And Clay has been doing this for, about 15 years with this when it comes to coaching?
Yeah, 15 years with coaching, yeah. And I was a pastor for 20 years before that.
Yeah. I met Clay. We were talking before the podcast here that I met Clay. We met each other about 36 years ago. Wow. And Clay has been doing missionary work, which is where I met him initially, pastoring, as he just mentioned. You also were involved in some law enforcement too, right?
Yep. Back before ministry. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. As we just said, he's been a life coach, him and his wife for over 15 years. They've got 4 children. I only know one of them, and she was like 2 years old when I met her. But you've got 3 other kids, 3 daughters and 1 son, and they're all grown up.
They are.
You got grandkids
with their own kids.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
All right. So, HeartLife Coaching. We're going to talk about this as it pertains to ministry, and there are some stats out there that are very disturbing, and they've been around for a long time. I saw one stat that said over 39% of people involved in ministry, pastors, have had extramarital affairs, at least one extramarital affair. And I actually did some double checking on that. And I've seen several stats around that area, 39, 40%. To me, that's just right. Amazing. There's also a survey that was done recently of Protestant people that are involved in ministry. And they found that 25% of clergy women and 20% of clergy men have been divorced at least once. And so it goes to say that when you're involved in ministry, which most of you listening to this podcast, I'm sure, are involved in some capacity, pastoral, key volunteer, whatever. Ministry is stressful, and ministry is also stressful on your relationships and your marriages. So, Clay, I guess I didn't officially welcome you. Thanks for being our guest today. Thank you for being here. Yeah. Well, we're glad you're here. And this is an area that you're an expert in. So tell me, I'm going to kick things off. I'll let Michael ask some questions here in a moment. But why is it doing ministry and marriage, why is it so difficult at times? Why is ministry so hard on marriages?
Well, let me answer that as a recovering Pharisee and a recovering people pleaser. Part of that is that a lot of people go into ministry and thinking ministry is the end all. And the reality is there's a biblical premise about relationship that's kind of the opposite. From Genesis on, God intended marriage and family to show the church how to be the church instead of the other way around. But we go into that thinking the other direction, and then we get in there. And if you have a tendency toward people pleasing, or you're in it for with good intentions, but it's hard to not do that particular thing, then that stress starts to happen because your focal point becomes what you're doing in the church, and your relationship suffers because of that. So, and that's a big part of that.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. Michael and I have both been involved in ministry, and Steve is not here, but Steve has been involved, maybe not as a pastor, but he has been involved in leadership teams and involved in
Mhm.
boards. So we certainly can understand that. I think that's interesting because I know when I first got involved in ministry in the late '70s, that was my goal was, oh, ministry. I want to serve God. I
Me
want to
too.
serve Jesus. And I just thought, well, this is it. I'm doing it now,
Mhm.
and this is it. But it did have a
Well,
strain on my
we were actually
marriage.
taught that, those of us that came out of the Jesus movement time frame, ministry was everything, and that was up front, and
Yeah,
everything else was secondary to that, and we were actually taught that
yeah,
with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Problem is, as you do real life and try to do a relationship in the midst of trying to do that, and particularly pastorally, that's going to be a pushback if you're
yeah,
not really careful.
yeah, absolutely. Hmm. What are the warning signs that you may have a marriage that's in trouble? Because I don't know about you, but uh, I was married 10 years and divorced, and now I've been married 27 years to my second wife. And uh, especially in that first marriage, I didn't necessarily see the warning signs, or if I did, I was living in denial. What are some of the warning signs for people that their marriage might be in trouble?
Well, a couple of things would apply there with it. One is we, Scott and I use a threefold test on ourselves all the time because we're still in full time ministry, even though we're doing what we're doing. What are you spending your time doing? What are you spending your focus on? And, what are your priorities? And we kind of filter what's happening with that. And particularly when we get to where we're so busy that we're passing in the night, which happens so often in ministry, we kind of go back to that scale and start looking at, okay, where are we here? What does that play? The other thing that's a real concern is what I call a parallel marriage. We basically, we're nice roommates, but we don't realize we are. And we connect over when the gas bills due or when the kid needs to go to soccer, and we may have sex every once in a while. But other than that, we're living two different lives parallel. That's probably the biggest thing to recognize is if when's the last, and I ask couples when they come to us, ministry couples in particular, when's the last time you went on a date? When's the last time you had sex? When's the last time you had some time connecting emotionally and talking about, your dreams and your feelings and where you want to go in life and where you are now? Because everybody goes through different seasons. Are you doing any of that stuff? And the majority of the time, the answer to that's no, particularly when they come see us 2-on-2 for coaching, for relational coaching with that. And an interesting stat that we've discovered just on the people that we've seen through the years is the average couple that comes to see us waits 7 years from the time they initially start having problems to go and get help. And that's a huge deal. And that's kind of why we're involved in doing this and why some of the stuff we're going to talk about today about the course we've designed and workshops we're doing and other things to try to be preemptive and get people ahead of working on their relationship before they get to that crisis place. Because once they're there, it's pretty tough, and especially after 7 years worth. That's a lot of negativity in that space between you, and that negativity is toxic. It's my wife has this illustration of it being like babies when they're little, and you put them in a nice bubble bath, and they poop in the bathtub because little ones don't control themselves very well. Well, do you leave the kid in the tub when that happens? Of course not. You get the kid out and you wash them off and you disinfect the tub and do all this stuff. Why? Because you know what's in the tub is toxic. But we'll let negativity get in that space between us, which is actually the relationship itself. There's you and I and the relationship. We'll leave that toxicity in there for years at a time and do nothing with it. And then we wonder why we have problems because there's so much negativity and so much toxicity in that space. So that's a big deal. To get that out and put positive stuff in that is a huge game changer because it is toxic.
Michael, you have any things you want to ask Clay as we move on here?
Yeah, as I've in what I do is I've worked with a few pastors. I find that I often work with very driven pastors.
Mm-hmm.
And I am a recovering people pleaser. Um, because I did not have healthy balance in my life,
Mm-hmm.
including my relationship to my wife and to my kids. I was very driven to accomplish something great in ministry. And I had blinders to
Mhm.
things that really matter, and I was out of balance. I was really out of balance. And
Mhm.
what I find is there's some commonality to those ministry folks that are driven. Some of it we've been taught, and some of it we just learn that we we ignore everything other than the what we think should be the one thing, and we leave our family behind.
Yep.
So how do we help that driven person see the error of their ways?
Mhm. Well, I think one of the things is there's another facet to that too, which is church culture. A lot of times pushes that on us as a clergy person, as a clergy family, and recognizing. And you kind of have to go back, in the particular place where I pastored through years, when I would initially interview with a church, for example, et cetera. I would let it be known. My priority is my family and my marriage first, because that's God's standard with that, number one. Number two, my wife, in our case, is not going to be the associate pastor. Her gifts and skills are helps behind the
Yeah,
scenes. So if that's your
Yeah.
two for
expectation,
one deal.
you got the wrong guy. Being upfront with that kind of stuff instead of just letting it happen a lot of times, because that creates a tremendous amount of pressure on, and particularly somebody like my wife. Phil, Sonia well. She's sweet as the day is long, but she has her limits. She can turtle up on you, but she can be a snapping turtle too, and she knows I would say. But her giftings are behind the scenes and mercy stuff, and up front she can do up front, but that's not her strong suit, and she knows that. Being aware of what your gifts are and what the spiritual gifts God's giving you as well is so important when you're doing this, and just acknowledging that in the places where you're trying to do ministry, whether that be a parachurch ministry or church or whatever, uh, and being in front of that. For the people pleasing end, I really encourage people and really take a look at. A lot of times we find that the habit of people pleasing is probably not just about what they're doing in church. It's getting aware that they have history with that back here in the past too, and that awareness makes it where that enters into the present and into what they're doing. And a lot of times that's enough to interrupt the pattern of just being aware of. Growing up, you may be put in that position. If you had a family system like mine growing up, boy, that was the deal. So it was easy to bring that into ministry as part of that. In the process, though, in our early years of ministry, we had problems with our relationship, and our kids suffered because of that
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Within that, before we got on, Phil, you asked me a question about my big wake up call with all this was my kids.
Your kids.
My Heather, my oldest,
Yeah.
at times she really, because we weren't okay as a couple, I think she suffered more as a clergy kid.
And
There
tell
were
me
definitely,
tell me, I don't mean to cut you off, but I was going to ask you this a little bit later. How did she suffer specifically, and how do pastors' kids, PKs, and I think, Mike, you're a PK, right? How do they suffer just specifically? So if I'm listening to this podcast, can I see some signs that my kids may
yeah.
not be very healthy?
I'm going to tell you a lot. Most of it is about what you're doing with each other as a couple and how your relationship is. Because interesting, I've talked to all my kids about this interestingly during the holiday before you sent this question, and Heather, my oldest, pretty much, has told us, well, because y'all were not in a place growth wise, personally as well as a couple, our relationship wasn't the best it could be. Plus, I was doing all the people pleasing stuff on top of it. So she kind of got left out of that picture because the priority was ministry and not the marriage and not family. And that reaped fruit because, and also I didn't protect, look over her. There were several church situations where I learned years later, they were making comments to her and stuff that was totally off, inappropriate for people within the church to be doing. And as a teenager, she's having to deal with all that. That's that. And I wasn't aware of that, nor was I paying attention because I was busy doing the other stuff. and relationally, we were in a different place. My third daughter, we had the same conversation. My third daughter, once we started growing ourselves and doing a lot of internal work within ourselves, but also in our relationship, getting our relationship to where we were just more than surviving, where we started to thrive, which is kind of what led us into doing what we do now. You know, her comment was, it was a real enjoyable experience for me because y'all were okay. And because y'all were okay, we were interacting. You were interacting with us more because we were your priority and the church was second as part of that. So very different.
So by the time the third kid came around, you got it right.
Yeah, I hope so. Some of the others may argue with that. I don't know.
What if my spouse won't admit that we're having problems? And in most cases, not all, but most cases, it's the guy, who's oblivious or just in denial. What if one of the people doesn't admit, we're doing okay, we don't need counseling, we don't need to go through this? How do you approach that?
Well, part of it is, and one of the things we teach in all the work that we do is the embracing of differences. Your reality, in this case, your spouse's reality of what's going on in the situation is just as valid as what yours is personally. And are we really learning and listening to each other? Most of the time we don't listen, and our culture teaches us that. We get accolades for Toastmasters and talking and all this stuff, but we don't for listening. And we know now, neuroscience tells us now that the average person retains 17% of what they hear. And that's if you're in a good mood. If you're in any way distressed or in a state you don't need to be, that number will drop considerably. And it's because we have a little lawyer and a little analyst that sit on our shoulder. Bill, if you're talking to me and I'm preparing my rebuttal or I'm figuring out how to fix it, I'm not listening to you. I'm doing this instead. And non-verbally, you know that in a heartbeat. Now, when it comes to couple on this topic of, hey, we're having an issue with this, is realizing, and we emphasize this with clergy couples all the time, is realizing sooner or later, you may think everything's hunky-dory and it's going just fine, but sooner or later, the issues you are having are going to ooze under the door, and they're going to impact your family and they're going to impact your church, whether you like it or not. And it leaves you in a place of vulnerability, whether that be, a potential for affairs, as those statistics you shared, stumbling into pornography, which, by the way, 50% of pastors will engage in this week. That's a staggering level. And why? Because we're not nurturing and not, working on the relationship and making that the priority as part of that. One of the things that it kind of overlaps to something else you and I were talking about online was the reason we don't do that, or one spouse may not do that, is the whole issue of how's it going to look. How's it going to look to the church? How's it going to look? Are people going to think less of us because we need to work on our relationship? And that flies in the face of a real important biblical concept when it comes to a marriage relationship. And that's Paul talking about, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Vulnerability biblically is seen as strength. But a lot of times, because of pride, ego, and particularly people pleasing, we don't want to go there and be vulnerable with that. And some people have a hard time with that. We've worked with a particular clergy couple, and he had a really hard time doing that initially. But what he started seeing was that as they were open about their relationship and that they were having to work on things, etc., people in their congregation started coming out of the woodwork of saying, hey, we're having trouble too. We didn't want to talk about it because it wasn't okay to do that. Thank you for being vulnerable and putting that on the table and let us know you're real and human being too, even though you're a pastor, and you got to work on this too, because that's really helpful and encouraging to us. So in a lot of ways, the exact opposite can happen with you being vulnerable, letting your congregation know that, hey, we're working on stuff right now. Okay, we just started. It's one of those seasons, and part of that is letting them know that you need to, as a clergy person or as a family, you're going to make an adjustment too. That's going to impact them too. Why? Because our relationship is a priority. The church is third, God, the relationship, then the church. And letting them know that may mean a shift. So heads up, here's what's coming. That's a lot of the resistance. I mean, it really gets down to, in my own case, and I'll just tell it myself, it was pride and ego that I didn't want to do that. And what I'd been taught in my early discipleship years, like we were talking about earlier, of it wasn't okay to make marriage the priority. And my relationship with Sonny the priority, even though that's the most and has been the most important thing in my life for 40 years. And we've been together 43. That's a long time. And when you don't make that the priority, you know, that's going to show in what you're doing and particularly what you're trying to do in ministry. Is that true, Michael? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I grew up as a PK. So everything that you're saying resonates with me. So I felt like your youngest daughter, that I wasn't a priority and I really wasn't in the mix of things and connected in that way. And then transitioned to doing that myself because I was of the mind that there was nothing more important than the church. And erroneously allowed my life to get really out of balance and not the correct priority of relationship. And then let's get to serving.
Yeah.
And so just kind of getting back to what I was saying earlier. So when when one of the spouses doesn't feel like there's a problem, I guess it's just going to take courage for the one that does think there's a problem to have kind of a sit down to meet Jesus, no pun intended, but a sitting down and saying, look, we really do need to sit down and talk here and be realistic about how we're feeling and our thoughts.
It gets down to a basic question, Phil, which is being right more important to me than the relationship? That's what it really gets down to the nuts and bolts with it too. And a lot of times we prefer being right, and that shows itself in a relationship. We'd rather be right and pretend nothing's going on or that we have any problems versus, okay, well, you're seeing problems. Okay, let's sit down and talk about what are you seeing? Maybe I'm not seeing that. Being in the place of being curious and a learner instead of being right. Yeah. That's a big part of that.
So maybe taking the humble road. If you feel like there's a problem and the other one doesn't, maybe taking the humble path and saying, okay, well, tell me how you feel, and that kind of a thing. Really making space for the other person.
I mean, Michael, when you're all focused on ministry, you have blinders on, so you're not seeing anything other than what you're doing in the daily. If you're a pastor in the church, if that's what's happening, and okay, there may be all kinds of stuff going on over here, and you're not seeing any of it. So, getting aware, taking the blinders off, looking around, listen to input with that. Even with as good a relationship as friendship Sonia and I had, my kids speaking into that was like, what are you guys doing? You're never home. We're never party. We don't sit down and have meals. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. Those are my priorities. What's happening here? And I had to kind of backpedal and say, you know what? You're right. I need to rethink this and take another look.
Yeah, good stuff. So we're running out of time here, but I want to get your website out here for people to check it out, because you do coaching and you do it online. And you have different classes. The website is HeartLife Coaching DWF. Now you're in the DFW, right?
DFW, right. Yeah, Dallas Fort Worth.
So you're in the Dallas Fort Worth area.
Right.
Let me make sure I write this down here. So again, let me repeat it. HeartLife Coaching DFW.
Correct.
.com. DFW.com. So HeartLife Coaching, DFW. So that's the best way for people to get a hold of you. They can look at your website. They can see you have different plans and different classes.
We have a 3-month course, and particularly and a lot of this is designed for clergy and clergy couple, not only and also to use with their people in their church. Right. That we have a 3-month course, a relational course of how to get to the place of thriving. Instead of surviving your relationship, and how do you re-engage and do that. When you finish that 3-month course, you're invited to a private group where that's on Facebook, where you receive encouragement and interaction with us and other couples that are kind of walking the journey with you as part of that. And we also invite you to come to we have a Safe Conversations workshop that we teach online as well as live, and we do that for churches and the general public as well, where you can learn how to communicate in a different way, in a structured, safe way than you ever had before, which is really different, to be able to talk without criticism and listen without judgment, and how to actually connect beyond your differences, because differences is the primary reason why couples fight.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
All that's available there. So check that out.
And so I just want to encourage our listeners, our viewers here, because we're on YouTube here as well as streamingchurch.tv, as well as the podcast audio here. Check out HeartLifeCoachingDFW.com. And I'm pretty sure I can speak for you on this, Clay. Your wife, Sonia, would also be available. So if somebody had a question,
absolutely,
they could talk to one of you guys. You wouldn't charge them just to talk about something for, and be able to get some help, because I just feel really strongly about this. I'm sure Michael agrees. I mean, this is such an important topic for those of us involved in any capacity of ministry, whether it's actually full-time or part-time, or you're a volunteer. Even if you're a volunteer, not on staff, you still face these issues, especially if you're a driven volunteer, like many people I know. You really want to serve the church, but it can affect your relationships. And so, all right, well, good. I'm sorry we're out of time, but this has been good. We'll definitely have you back on again, Clay.
Right.
Clay Arnold has been our guest. And if you missed all that information, you can always contact us, support@streamingchurch.tv. We're a tech company, but we are also involved in ministries, and that's why we are doing something like this today. It's not really tech related, but we have a heart for people involved in ministry, and that's why we do these different topics that may not always be tech related, but very important to us. So thank you, Clay. We sure appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. And thank you, Michael, for being with us today.
Always a pleasure.
All right, as usual. And Steve Lacy will be with us again next time. I'm Phil Thompson. Thank you for listening and watching the Church Solutions podcast. Please take care of yourself. We'll catch you again next time.